My sister and I finished college together, but only her tuition was covered. She earned it. You didn't, my parents said. Our parents showed up for the ceremony, smiling, until they saw what I had done. Their smiles disappeared. I'm Fiona, 24, and I run logistics for Company A, which means I juggle international vendor delays, broken contract clauses, and team meetings I mostly lead in silence because action speaks louder than status reports. Back when I was applying to colleges, I never thought I'd end up in the same graduating class as my younger sister, but she skipped a grade junior year, which my parents framed as proof of her brilliance, even though I had maintained a higher GPA and worked part-time since sophomore year, while she never worked a day in her life. When the acceptance letters came in, mine was first, but they barely looked up when I told them. They just said, "Good for you, Fiona," and asked me to set the table for dinner, and 10 minutes later, when my sister Natalie walked in waving her own letter from the same school, they screamed like she won the lottery and popped a bottle of cider and said things like, "We knew you were born for this." I should have expected what happened next, but I didn't. I still believed fairness was possible. 2 weeks later, during dinner, my dad cleared his throat and told us they'd been planning for this moment for years and that Natalie's tuition would be fully covered because she had the clearest potential, and I sat there staring while my mom nodded and said, "You've always been self-sufficient, Fiona. We know you'll figure it out." I didn't speak the rest of that meal, and after clearing the dishes, I went to my room and applied for 2 more scholarships and a 3rd job at a late-night diner 20 minutes from the house because I knew right then they were never going to come around. Graduation day was supposed to be hers, or so they thought. They came early, brought flowers, and posed for photos with her, ignoring me until they were forced to acknowledge me when I was called to the stage first, not last, not buried in the list, but first. I stood at the podium with a calm they didn't expect and started my speech with the exact words they once used to dismiss me. "She earned it, you didn't." And I let the room go still as every head turned toward them while I went on to explain that I'd worked every semester, paid every bill, and still graduated at the top of our class. The president hadn't told me about the award until just before the ceremony. He leaned in and said, "You'll be the first student to get this." And I knew then that this day wasn't just about a diploma. It was a reckoning. I watched my mom's smile drop the second he said I'd been chosen for the university's highest academic honor, and when he added that I'd done it all without a single cent from family support, I saw my dad look down and pretend to check his program. Natalie froze, I saw it. Her hands stopped clapping, and her eyes flicked toward our parents like she wanted them to do something, say something, but they didn't, because they couldn't, because everyone in the auditorium now knew exactly what they'd done. After the ceremony, people swarmed me, faculty, classmates, even strangers, asking about my business, my job offer, my story, and I answered every question because I wanted every word to reach my parents' ears even if they wouldn't come talk to me directly. Natalie finally came over while they hung back by the exit pretending to be busy with a family friend, and she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "I did. You just didn't listen." When we got back to the rented house they'd booked for the family, they acted like nothing had happened, but no one wanted to talk about her major or her thesis anymore because all anyone asked was, "Fiona, how did you do it?" By the time dessert was served, it was clear the narrative had shifted permanently. This wasn't Natalie's celebration anymore, and my parents looked like they were counting how many people they'd have to lie to in the weeks ahead just to pretend they supported me. But they could rewrite what had already been said in front of hundreds. That night, before I left, my mom said, "We're proud of you." And I looked at her, paused, and replied, "Since when?" The thing people never saw growing up was how early the favoritism started, not in big gestures, but in the way our parents explained every decision as logical, rational, and deserved whenever it was in Natalie's favor, and conveniently dismissed anything I did as coincidence or luck. When I turned 8 and got secondhand books while Natalie got a new science kit with her name engraved, they said she needed tools to explore her gifts, and when I asked why I didn't get the same, they said art wasn't a real future, and I should be grateful for practical things. By 10, I stopped bothering to tell them when I placed in school competitions or was chosen to lead a group project because they never came, never clapped, and never asked how it went, not even once, while Natalie's every achievement was a full family event complete with photos and takeout dinners. In middle school, I tried to talk to my dad about starting a summer dog walking business so I could buy my own tablet for homework, but he said, that sounds like a waste of time, then turned to Natalie and asked if she wanted to join a robotics camp, which cost more than I'd earn all summer. By the time I enter high school, I'd already figured out that if I wanted something, I'd have to get it myself, so I started working at a bakery before school twice a week, then added babysitting on weekends, and even though I was exhausted, I made enough to pay for my own phone and all my school supplies. My parents never asked where the money came from or how I balanced everything because they were too busy filling out college prep forms for Natalie's extracurriculars and organizing test prep tutoring while telling me not to stretch myself too thin on side jobs. When I told my mom I was applying for early college admission and asked for help writing my personal statement, she said she was busy editing Natalie's essays and suggested I ask my English teacher, and when I did, he said, "I've read your writing before, Fiona. You don't need help. You just need someone to actually read it." Junior year, I won a district-level entrepreneurship contest with a proposal I built from scratch while working night shifts at a diner, and when my economics teacher called home to share the news, my mom answered with, "Oh, that's nice. Natalie has a Model UN thing this weekend, too." I stayed quiet through all of it, not because I didn't care, but because I realized early that proving anything to them was a game I could never win, and every time I tried, they moved the goalpost or told me I was imagining things or being dramatic. Natalie was always their investment, and I was the backup plan, the one they expected to just figure things out on her own while they poured time, energy, and money into someone they decided mattered more. When Natalie turned 16, they bought her a car, something safe and shiny and pre-insured, while I was still taking the bus with a broken zipper on my backpack, and when I asked about it, Dad said, "It makes sense. She has more places to be." When I finally bought my own used car with money saved from a year's worth of split shifts and careful budgeting, they warned me not to get too ambitious or fall behind in school and told me car insurance would be on me because independence builds character. The only person who consistently showed up for me was my grandmother, who called every Sunday like clockwork and always asked about me first, not Natalie, and when I told her I'd gotten into my dream university, she didn't say, "I'm not surprised." Like everyone else, she said, "I always knew they were wrong to count you out." She didn't have much money, but she offered to co-sign any loan I needed, which she did without hesitation, and when I told her I didn't think I could afford it, she said, "If they won't invest in you, I will, even if all I can offer is my name." It was that moment that shifted everything because someone finally said yes to me first, not after Natalie had already gotten hers, not after everyone else had taken their piece. It was just for me. I worked even harder after that, taking more hours, saving more aggressively, and applying for every scholarship that didn't have an application fee, and by the end of senior year, I'd secured enough through a combination of grants, loans, and 3 jobs to make it to school without asking them for a cent. I didn't tell them when I moved in, didn't ask for help with boxes or furniture or anything, and when they dropped Natalie off in a campus SUV packed with new bedding and mini fridges, I was already settled in a shared apartment an hour away from campus with 2 roommates I met online and a schedule that barely left room to breathe. The difference was obvious the moment classes started. While Natalie partied and joined every club that handed out free pizza, I was waking up at 5, studying on my commute, and clocking in for 8-hour shifts after lectures, because failing wasn't an option for me. There were no safety nets, no fallback plans, no surprise checks in the mail, and the first time my car broke down on the highway, I called roadside assistance myself and used half my grocery money to fix the radiator because calling home wasn't going to change anything. By the time first semester ended, Natalie was flunking one course and struggling in another, and I had a 4.0 GPA, a steady income from my campus job, and a growing list of professors who knew me by name. Not once did my parents ask how I was doing. The day I got my acceptance letter to University A, I opened it in the parking lot outside my shift at the bakery and called my grandmother first because I knew she would celebrate even if nobody else would. And when I told her, she laughed and said, "Tell them before they find out some other way." That night at dinner, I waited until the table was quiet before saying, "I got into University A, the business track," and my dad didn't even look up from his phone before saying, "Good, start looking at loan options," and my mom nodded like I just told them I passed a routine test. 15 minutes later, Natalie came home holding a similar envelope and screaming like she won something that had been hers all along, and within seconds my dad stood and clapped, My mom hugged her, and someone opened a bottle of cider, while I sat still watching my own achievement disappear under the noise. When I brought it up the next day and asked why the reactions were so different, my mom said, "You're older. We expect this from you." And my dad added, "It's not a competition, Fiona. Stop keeping score," which is what they always said when the numbers didn't go in their favorite's favor. A week later, they called a family meeting which sounded serious until I realized it was just an announcement about tuition where they said they'd been saving since Natalie was little, and while they wished they could help us both, they had to be strategic, and Natalie had long-term potential. I asked quietly, so there was never a plan to help me, and my dad said, "You've always managed on your own." Like that was some compliment, and not the outcome of years of forced independence, because no one else bothered to show up. I nodded once, stood up, left the table, and walked to my room where I applied for 5 more scholarships, emailed my guidance counselor, and made an appointment to increase my hours at the coffee shop because if they weren't going to invest in me, I'd invest in myself. Grandma co-signed a loan for the amount I couldn't cover, told me not to worry about her credit, and said if anything went wrong, she talked to the bank herself, and when I cried over the phone because I didn't want to put that burden on her, she said, "You're not a burden, they are." The day Natalie went dorm shopping with Mom, I was calculating rent splits and grocery budgets with 3 girls I'd never met before who agreed to let me sublease a shared unit near the city transit line because campus housing was out of my range. I didn't tell them I was moving in early because I didn't want a ride or a farewell dinner or any of the last-minute affection they suddenly remembered to offer when guilt caught up, and when Mom asked if I needed help packing, I said, "You've done enough already." Natalie posted photos of her dorm room online with string lights, new bedding, and a caption about new beginnings, while I was cleaning the baseboards in a shared apartment so I wouldn't lose my deposit if we got inspected. I took a job at a campus cafe that paid just enough to cover my half of rent if I worked weekends and picked up weekday mornings, and between that and a few freelance gigs I found online helping local businesses with email copy and spreadsheets, I managed to keep the lights on. My professors noticed early because I asked questions nobody else did, turned in assignments ahead of schedule, and referenced real-world examples in papers that came from actually working with clients instead of just reading case studies. Halfway through first semester, my marketing professor asked to speak with me after class and said, "You should think about starting something for yourself. You understand pressure in a way that can't be taught." That was the first time I admitted I already had quietly just a few clients, nothing big, and he told me to come by his office next week and bring a rough plan so he could help me refine it because students like you don't come around often. I kept the business small that first year, just email marketing and scheduling for 3 clients, but it paid better than the cafe and let me drop 2 shifts without losing income, which gave me more time to focus on school, and I spent that time doubling down on courses that aligned with where I saw myself heading. Natalie called once around midterms to complain about how hard her classes were and how unfair her professor was, and when I tried to give her tips on time management, she said, "You don't get it. You don't have to juggle everything I do," which would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. I didn't correct her because it wasn't worth the energy, but I stopped replying to her texts unless it was something important because I realized she wasn't ready to hear how different our realities really were. At the end of the semester, I made the dean's list, landed a new client through a referral, and managed to save enough to cover books for spring without dipping into loan funds. And when I called home to tell them, no one answered, so I left a voicemail they never returned. Grandma sent a card with $20 taped inside and a note that said, "Not much, but it's mine to give," and I taped that note above my desk because it meant more than anything I'd heard from my parents in years. During winter break, I stayed in the city because I couldn't afford the travel and didn't want to sit through another holiday meal where Natalie's grades were excused and mine were ignored, and instead I used the time to research LLCs and tax options for my growing side business. By the time classes started again, I had a portfolio, a business name, and enough recurring clients to officially stop picking up cafe shifts, and when I told Grandma, she said, "That's what happens when you stop waiting for permission." I didn't tell my parents anything about the business. They never asked. During spring semester, I was assigned to a group project in business strategy where one of the members, who ran a local clothing brand, asked if I could help organize his email campaigns, and when I did, he paid me double my rate and referred 2 more people by the end of the month. I added freelance digital support to my student profile, created a simple landing page using a free template, and listed my services in 3 student business forums where, within weeks, I started getting steady inquiries from local shops and student-led startups. One afternoon, while reviewing a class case study, my professor pulled me aside and asked, "Are you the Fiona who helped company B triple their online signups last month?" And when I said yes, he laughed and said, "Keep doing what you're doing. Theory's overrated when you've got real traction." I was averaging 15 hours a week between client work and administrative upkeep, still maintaining my 4.0, and starting to turn down clients I didn't want to work with because I no longer needed the money. I was choosing based on fit. That freedom felt new. At the end of sophomore year, I stopped applying for summer internships and instead reinvested into scaling my own business, which by then included 3 other part-time student contractors I paid from earnings, so I could focus on larger accounts and build strategy packages. My advisor invited me to a departmental mixer for standout students, and I overheard another professor saying my name when introducing me to a visiting alum who owned a consulting firm and offered to connect me with someone at company C if I ever considered post-grad employment. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes either. What I said was, "I'll be hiring soon too if you know students who need experience." And the look on his face told me he wasn't used to hearing that from someone still turning in homework. At the start of junior year, I made enough to move into a single apartment and replace my old car using cash from a quarterly retainer I secured with a real estate client, and I sent Grandma the first rent payment check she refused to cash with a note that said, "Use this for something ridiculous." She called crying and said, "They're going to regret underestimating you, Fiona, just wait." Meanwhile, my parents still didn't ask questions, and Natalie still posted about stress and midterms and weekend parties, and the only time I heard from her directly was when she needed help proofreading a paper she started the night before it was due. I helped, but I stopped fixing her grammar, just pointed out the structure, let her do the work, told myself I wasn't responsible for teaching someone who never wanted to learn from me. When she got a B-, she texted, "You missed a few things," and I typed but didn't send. "I didn't miss anything, you just never earned it." By mid-year, one of my professors asked me to guest speak in his entrepreneurship class to explain how I scaled a digital operation while enrolled full-time, and after the session ended, 3 students emailed me asking for job openings, which was the moment I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was running something real. Then the email came. The business department nominated me for a national innovation showcase sponsored by an industry magazine and Company D, with a grand prize of $50,000 in funding and press coverage, and the application required 3 years of financial records, growth metrics, and a final pitch in person. I submitted everything within a week and spent the next 3 preparing a deck, rehearsing a 10-minute pitch, and consolidating testimonials from satisfied clients, 3 of whom offered to fly in for the final round just to vouch for me. I didn't tell my parents anything about it because I already knew they'd only care if it made them look good, not if it made me feel proud. And when Natalie posted about applying to an unpaid internship with a local council member, I liked the post and said nothing else. I got into the finals. The presentation was scheduled 1 month before graduation and fell on the same weekend as Natalie's sorority gala, which my parents flew in to attend, rented a house for, and never once mentioned asking me if I wanted a room. I used points I earned from business travel to stay overnight in a nearby hotel, and when I walked into that conference room, I wasn't nervous, I was prepared. I delivered the pitch, answered all questions clearly, cited real data, and finished with a line I hadn't rehearsed but knew was true. Everything I built came from being told no. They announced the winner the next day, and when I saw my name on the certificate with first place, Business Innovation Award, I didn't feel excited. I felt ready. I sent the photo to Grandma, who called and said, "Send me 5 copies. I'm framing them for everyone who doubted you." The press release dropped the next morning. I got emails from 3 companies asking if I was considering offers, LinkedIn messages from recruiters, and a personal invitation from the dean to meet and discuss a feature in the university paper. Still, my parents said nothing. I checked. They liked Natalie's photo of her gala dress that same weekend. Not a word to me. Not a call, not a text. Nothing. 2 weeks before graduation, Natalie showed up outside my apartment without warning, holding a folder of notes and blinking like she hadn't slept, and before I could say anything she said, "I'm failing my final seminar, and I don't know what to do." I asked what happened, and she explained that her senior thesis had been flagged for lack of proper methodology. Her advisor gave her 3 weeks to fix it, and unless she completely rewrote it from scratch, she wasn't walking at graduation. I let her in, sat her down, opened my laptop and said, "Start explaining what you've done so far and don't lie," because I wasn't going to waste time pretending she hadn't coasted for 4 years while I earned every inch of my progress. She admitted she never fully understood the structure, didn't read the core source material, and was relying on summaries from group chats and internet posts, which meant she wasn't just behind, she had nothing usable. I told her we'd need to meet every other day for the next 3 weeks, that she'd have to cancel everything else, and that I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it so she wouldn't drag our family name into scandal because I knew our parents would find a way to blame me if she didn't walk. The first few sessions were miserable. She argued when I told her to rewrite entire sections, complained about reading expectations, and at one point even said, "This is harder than I thought," which made me stare at her until she looked away. I didn't yell, didn't lecture, just kept assigning tasks, correcting structure, giving her deadlines, and making her cite every reference manually so she'd finally understand what accountability felt like. During one session, she asked, "How do you even do all of this, your business, your grades, this?" And I said, "Because I didn't have a choice," and kept typing. By the second week, something shifted. She started showing up on time, bringing her own notes, referencing readings without prompts, and when she handed me a revised section that finally met academic standards, I nodded and said, "Now that's a start," and she smiled without sarcasm for the first time in months. 3 days before submission, she broke down crying mid-sentence and said, "I didn't know how hard you had it," and I told her that knowing now didn't undo the past, but it could fix her future if she stopped pretending nothing happened. The night before her submission deadline, she texted me a photo of her confirmation email with the caption, "Couldn't have done it without you," and I replied, "Now you owe me one." We didn't talk about what that meant yet, but she knew. Meanwhile, I had my own preparation to handle. The dean emailed me confirming that I would deliver the business school address at commencement, said they were finalizing the press packet from my competition win, and added that the president of the university would also be announcing several surprise recognitions during the ceremony. I forwarded the email to Grandma, who said, "I'll be there early, front row, or I riot." Our parents hadn't mentioned anything about attending beyond a single group message that said, "We'll be there for Natalie's big day. Looking forward to seeing everyone," which I didn't respond to. The night before graduation, Natalie came by again, this time with takeout and a thank you card, and when I opened it, the message inside said, "You showed me what work looks like, I won't forget it." She said, "They still don't get it, you know." And I said, "They never will unless they're forced to." We didn't speak more than that. Graduation day came. Natalie walked ahead of me in the processional, and I could see our parents sitting near the front with flowers and cameras, waving at her like she was the only one crossing a milestone, not knowing they were about to get blindsided. When it was my turn to cross the stage for my diploma, I heard someone shout from the back. It was Grandma, loud and clear, and that's when my parents finally looked in my direction and noticed the sash, the cords, the distinction medal. The president stepped up to the mic after degrees were conferred and said, "Now we recognize a student whose journey embodies resilience, excellence, and innovation," and I saw my mother's hand pause mid-clap. He called my name. He said I graduated with the highest GPA in the business school, built a 6-figure company during enrollment, and won a national competition representing our university. He paused before saying, "And what many of you don't know, what makes this truly remarkable, is that she achieved all of this without a cent of family support." I turned my head and locked eyes with my parents as the applause started rising. My dad blinked rapidly and looked away. My mother's jaw tightened. Natalie clapped slowly, her expression unreadable to anyone but me. The president added, "For her excellence, determination, and impact, we are proud to name her our School of Business valedictorian," and I stepped up to the podium while the crowd stood, their claps echoing in my chest like confirmation. I started the speech the same way I started the story. "She earned it. You didn't." Then I said, "That's what I was told when college decisions came in, that someone else's dream was worth funding and mine was worth surviving, and I want every student in this room, whoever heard that, to know, it doesn't end there." The rest was a blur. People stood. People cried. The moment landed exactly the way I planned. And I didn't look back as I walked off that stage. As soon as the ceremony ended, people I barely knew started lining up to shake my hand. Professors hugged me. Classmates who had never spoken to me asked how I'd built everything from scratch, and while I tried to stay focused, I kept watching my parents, who stood stiffly near the side with forced smiles they couldn't hold for long. Natalie came over first, hugged me tighter than expected, and whispered, "They didn't know, Fiona." I didn't know how much they didn't know, and I said, "It was never about what they knew, it was about what they chose not to care about." Before they could walk away, the dean introduced me to a woman in a sharp suit who turned out to be the hiring manager from Company E, one of the largest consulting firms in the country, and she said, "We've followed your story since the competition. I hope you'll accept our offer." I shook her hand, told her I'd review the details, and smiled when she added, "It's a 6-figure base with relocation assistance if needed, but from what I hear, you probably won't need much help." After she walked off, I noticed my parents had moved closer, hovering like they wanted to say something but didn't know how to start, and when my dad finally stepped forward, he said, "Well, this was unexpected," with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. My mom added, "We had no idea you were so involved with everything," and I said, "You could've. All you ever had to do was ask." Dad cleared his throat and tried to pivot, saying, "We're having dinner tonight at the rental house. Family's coming. It would mean a lot if you joined us." And I stared at him without answering for a long second before saying, "I already have plans." Natalie stood beside me and said, "I'm going with Fiona." And that's when our parents froze, probably realizing that their favorite daughter had started choosing differently. They didn't argue. They just nodded like they didn't know what else to do, and walked away without asking another question. We left campus with Grandma, who insisted on meeting the professors who had written my recommendations, the classmates I had mentored, and the staff from the financial aid office who once helped me figure out how to stay enrolled when my job hours got cut. At the business school reception later that day, people actually lined up to talk to her too, shaking her hand and saying things like, "You raised the right one," and I didn't correct them because it wasn't a mistake. The department head handed me a plaque for outstanding entrepreneurial impact and announced that I would be featured in the next edition of Business Talent magazine, and when I looked over, Natalie's eyes were wide because it was the first time she'd seen people treat me like I was the one worth celebrating. While we were talking to a group of alumni, Grandma whispered, "Now that they know what you've done, they're going to try to rewrite the story," and I said, "They already are." Later that evening, I got a text from Mom saying, "Dinner's at 6 if you change your mind. Your father would really like to talk." And I showed it to Natalie, who looked at it for a while before saying, "Are you going?" I said, "Only if we go together." When we arrived at the rental house, the conversation stopped the second we walked in, and the look on their faces told me they hadn't expected us to come, especially not together, especially not on my terms. Uncle James was the first to break the silence, clapping me on the back and saying, "So, I hear you've been building an empire in silence." And before I could reply, Aunt Rose added, "Why didn't your parents ever mention any of this?" My father tried to steer the conversation toward Natalie's thesis and her future plans, but someone asked directly, "Didn't the university say Fiona built a business while working and studying full-time?" And my mother mumbled something about different paths before falling quiet again. Grandma sat beside me like a wall they couldn't push through, and when someone asked how I funded everything, she leaned forward and said, "With her own money, her own labor, and one cosign loan I'm proud to have on my record." Dinner was tense. They kept trying to shift attention back to Natalie, but she wouldn't let them, kept bringing the conversation back to my speech, my award, the job offer, and every time she said something like, "You didn't know that, did you?" they flinched just enough for the room to notice. When dessert came out, my dad pulled me aside into the kitchen and said, "We may have made some mistakes." And I said, "You made a decision, not a mistake. You invested in one daughter and discarded the other." He said, "We didn't discard you, we assumed you'd be fine." And I said, "You assumed I'd disappear and I didn't, and now you're uncomfortable with what that says about you." He looked at me for a long time before saying, "We'd like to help now, maybe support you with housing or a graduation gift." And I laughed once, said, "My signing bonus already paid for my apartment," and walked back to the table without looking back. Before we left, Grandma stood and raised her glass and said, "To the one who built her future without shortcuts, without applause, and without permission," and the room raised their glasses with her while my parents stayed seated in silence. We walked out without saying goodbye. The morning after the dinner, I woke up to an email from Company E's HR department with a subject line, "Formal offer package," and when I opened the attachment and saw the starting salary, signing bonus, relocation stipend, and benefits, I didn't smile or cry or even breathe differently. I just forwarded it to Grandma with the message, "It's official." She called me less than a minute later, said, "Print it out, frame it, and hang it somewhere obvious when they visit," and I told her, "They're not visiting, they're revising." Natalie texted me that afternoon asking if we could meet privately, and when we sat down in a coffee shop near campus, she said, "They're trying to figure out how to spin this to the rest of the family," and I said, "They can say whatever they want. The receipts are public now." She looked down and said, "I didn't know it was this bad," and I said, "You didn't want to know, that's different." And she didn't argue because she finally understood that not looking wasn't neutral, it was a choice with consequences. She reached into her bag, pulled out a manila envelope, and handed it to me, saying, "It's a letter of recommendation for you from Professor Walsh. I told him everything you did for my thesis, and he said you deserved credit." I looked at her for a long time before saying, "You didn't have to do that." And she replied, "No, but I should have done a lot of things a long time ago, and I'm starting now." Later that week, the business magazine feature dropped with a headline, "Self-Made Under Pressure, Fiona's Blueprint for Real Growth," and the photo they used was from graduation, me flanked by Grandma and Natalie, no parents in sight, just the people who actually showed up. I mailed a physical copy to our home address without a note, without a return label, just the glossy cover, and an address they couldn't ignore. 2 days later, my mom texted, "We saw the article, proud of you," and I didn't respond because nothing about that message was for me, it was for their guilt. Instead, I focused on onboarding with Company E, where my title wasn't intern or junior anything, it was associate consultant with full client-facing authority, which meant I'd be leading meetings, not just shadowing them. During my first week, my team lead asked how I'd acquired so many technical skills without formal training, and I told her the truth. Necessity is more motivating than curriculum. She laughed and said, "We need more like you." By the end of the month, I was managing 2 accounts solo and mentoring a newer hire who reminded me a little too much of myself at 19, overqualified, underacknowledged, and just waiting for someone to give her space. I gave her space. Back on campus, my former professors kept emailing me to guest lecture or speak at panels, and I said yes to one event where the topic was resilience in business because I wanted students like me to hear from someone who hadn't started with family money or inherited connections. When I walked into the lecture hall, a few students recognized me from the magazine article and asked if I was going to talk about what it felt like to win without support, and I said, "No, I'm going to talk about what it takes to keep winning when support never comes." During Q&A, someone asked if my family ever apologized, and I said, "No," but they adjusted their tone once they realized silence no longer protected them. Afterward, Natalie approached me quietly and said, "That was brutal." And I said, "That was accurate," and she didn't argue. Later that month, Grandma hosted a small dinner at her place for just the 3 of us, and during dessert, she handed me a small velvet pouch and said, "This belonged to my mother. She gave it to me the day I graduated and told me to pass it on when I saw myself in someone else." I opened it to find a gold bracelet with a thin engraving that read, "Value is not granted, it's proven," and I didn't say anything because I knew she didn't want thanks. She wanted continuation. The next week, I met with the financial aid office at University A to discuss establishing a small scholarship fund from my competition winnings and business profits, and when they asked about criteria, I said, "No essays, no GPAs, I want students who've held 2 jobs, taken care of siblings, or fought through something invisible." The director looked up from her notes and said, "That narrows it down fast," and I said, "Good, that's the point." The first recipient was a sophomore accounting major who had lost both parents during her freshman year and still managed to stay enrolled while raising her younger brother. And when I met her for coffee and she said, "I didn't think anyone like me got noticed," I replied, "We notice each other." Meanwhile, my parents were still trying to find angles. They invited me to brunch 3 times, all of which I declined, and on the fourth attempt I said, "If you want to talk, you can come to the scholarship ceremony next month, otherwise, stop pretending." They showed up, sat quietly, clapped at the right times, didn't speak to press, didn't try to center themselves. After the ceremony, my dad shook the recipient's hand and said, "You remind me of my daughter." And she replied, "I know, she told me everything." We drove home in silence. 2 weeks after the scholarship ceremony, my mom sent a message asking if we could have a private lunch, just the two of us, and although I didn't answer immediately, I agreed after 3 days because I wanted to hear what she'd say when there was no one around to perform for. She chose the cafe near her work, and when I sat down, she said, "I don't know how to fix this, but I'm trying." And I said, "Then stop pretending you didn't break it on purpose." She paused, took a breath, and admitted, "We always thought Natalie needed more help. She seemed softer, more fragile, and we didn't want her to struggle." And I said, "So you chose the child who looked easier to protect instead of the one who asked for less." She said, "You never asked," and I leaned forward and told her, "Asking only works when someone's listening. You were never listening to me." She looked down and said, "I didn't know how strong you were," and I said, "It wasn't strength, it was survival." Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for, "Do you hate us?" And I answered honestly, "I don't, but I don't trust you either." She nodded once, said, "That's fair," and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to defend herself, which made me stay 10 minutes longer than I planned. When I got home, Natalie called to say our dad had told her he wanted to apologize in person, and I said, "That only matters if he doesn't need an audience." He came by my apartment the next Saturday, stood in the entryway holding a gift bag, and said, "I didn't know what to bring. Your mom said you don't like flowers," and I said, "You don't have to bring anything if you're not going to say anything real." He sat on the edge of a couch, cleared his throat, and said, "We failed you," which I didn't expect to hear so directly, and I watched him closely to see if he meant it. He said, "We thought we were being strategic, that putting everything into Natalie would guarantee one success, and that you'd be okay no matter what." And I said, "That wasn't a strategy, that was favoritism dressed up as logic." He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "I regret it." I asked him, "Do you regret it because I proved you wrong or because other people know now?" And he answered, "Both, but mostly because I know now." I didn't forgive him that day, but I didn't throw him out either. That was progress. 3 weeks later, the university reached out again and asked if I'd be willing to film a short testimonial for their admissions campaign targeting first-generation students, and I agreed under the condition that I could write my own script and mention the scholarship. They agreed. The video went viral on the university's social channels, especially the part where I said, "Sometimes the people who are supposed to support you never show up, build anyway." After the video gained traction, I got invited to speak at 2 high schools and a local youth program, and after the third one, a girl came up and said, "My mom tells me I should be more like my brother. Your story made me feel like that's not the end of mine." I stayed up that night rereading old messages from scholarship applicants, realized how many of them said the same thing in different words, that someone finally saw them, and decided to create a second fund specifically for high school students who were caregivers or had taken on adult responsibilities. I launched it quietly. No press. No ceremony. Just impact. At work, I was promoted to lead on one of our newer accounts and asked to co-write a strategy report for a high-profile client presentation, and my manager said, "It's unusual to move this fast, but then again, you're not usual." When she asked how I stayed so organized, I told her, "Because if I drop the ball, no one catches it." That quarter, our client satisfaction rating hit an all-time high, and when the CEO made a surprise visit to our office and shook hands with the entire team, he pulled me aside and said, "You've made quite an impression." He invited me to apply for a rotating leadership role across departments, a position normally offered to employees with at least 5 years. And when I asked why me, he said, "You don't just solve problems, You change the context they exist in. I told Natalie that night over dinner, and she said, "You're doing everything they thought I would." And I said, "You're doing things now they never expected you to do either." She said, "I'm thinking of applying for a policy fellowship to study educational equity." And I said, "Do it, but only if you plan to speak for people you've actually listened to." She said she would. I believed her. Our parents started mentioning my name again during phone calls to relatives, sending clippings of my achievements as if they'd always believed in me. And while I hated the revisionist tone, I no longer needed to correct them because the truth lived in public records. I told Grandma, "They're still trying to rewrite the beginning," and she said, "Let them, everyone else saw the ending." 6 months after graduation, I received an invitation to speak at the university's annual Alumni Summit, not just as a former student, but as the keynote speaker for the Business Innovation Panel. And when I asked the coordinator how they chose me, she said, "Your name came up in every committee without hesitation." I called Grandma first, told her the date, and she said, "I already marked my calendar the second you graduated." And when I told Natalie, she said, "Let me know if you want help running your slides or prepping anything. This time I take notes." 2 days before the event, my dad texted to say he and Mom had registered to attend, added that they'd like to bring a gift, and I replied, "You don't need to bring anything, just don't interrupt." They arrived early, sat near the front, and for once didn't wave or try to get my attention, which was the first smart thing they'd done in a long time. When I took the stage and saw their faces mixed among strangers and supporters, I started with, "Some of us are given a straight path, others are handed broken pieces and expected to make it work anyway." And I knew right then they remembered every broken piece they'd handed me. I spoke for 25 minutes, described how I built a company out of time most students spent commuting, how I invested every rejection into leverage, and how I turned absence into autonomy, because waiting for help was wasting energy I didn't have. I ended by saying, "You can't control where you start, but you get to choose what you finish." And when I stepped off stage, the standing ovation was louder than anything I'd heard the day I graduated. After the panel, 3 students approached to ask for mentorship, 2 professors thanked me for speaking honestly, and a director from Company F asked if I'd ever consider leading an accelerator program, which I said I'd think about. My parents waited until the end of the reception to approach, and when they did, my mother handed me a small box and said, "It's not much, just something we thought you should have had years ago." And inside was the college savings account statement I never knew existed. The balance was near zero, but it had my name on it. I looked up and said, "So you did start one, you just didn't finish it." And my dad said, "We didn't think it would matter, we were wrong." I nodded, handed the box back, and said, "Keep it. I've paid my own way now, and that's worth more." They didn't argue. They didn't offer again. They just said they were proud of me, and this time, it didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like something they weren't sure how to say, but knew they had to try. After they left, Natalie stayed behind, handed me a flyer for a nonprofit she'd been working with, and said, "We're building a mentorship hub for high school girls with zero family support. We want to name one of the rooms after someone who made it without help." I said, "Don't name it after me unless you're going to fund it with real money." And she laughed and said, "Already done. It's coming from my new grant stipend." I stared at her and said, "You're really doing this?" And she said, "Because of you, because you didn't just change your own path, you lit up the ones behind you." That night, Grandma called to say she saw clips online from the summit, said she watched the standing ovation 10 times, and asked if I remembered the first time I said I wanted to prove them wrong. I told her, "I remember saying it, I don't remember needing it anymore." And she said, "That's how you know you won." The next day, I emailed the business department and asked to create a new scholarship, one that didn't just reward resilience but funded startups run by students without family safety nets. And when they asked what to call it, I said, "Call it the silent build." That's what it was. My inbox filled within a week with submissions from students running food prep businesses, resale operations, translation services, and tutoring networks while managing full course loads and part-time jobs. And I reviewed each one with a level of respect I wish someone had shown me. I funded 3 immediately. No conditions. No essays. Just belief. When I told Natalie, she said, "You're going to be the person our parents wish they knew." And I said, "No, I'm going to be the person I needed when they weren't watching." Months later, when the university released its annual report, it featured a full-page story on the silent build program, quoted one of the recipients saying, "This is the first time someone bet on me with no strings attached," and listed me as the founding donor. My parents mailed me a copy with a page bookmarked and a note that said, "You're changing lives. We're finally watching." I threw the note away, but kept the report. The facts were enough. On the one-year anniversary of my graduation, I sat down with my accountant to finalize the paperwork transferring full operational control of my digital agency to the 2 student contractors I had trained from scratch, and when he asked why I was stepping back, I said, "Because it was never meant to be mine forever. It was meant to be proof." They signed their partnership documents the next day, and one of them said, "We're not going to let your name down." And I said, "You're not carrying my name, you're building your own now." That same week, Company E announced internal promotions for the next rotation cycle, and I was offered the lead strategy consultant role for a global client initiative that would send me across 4 countries in 9 months, with full autonomy to build a project team and report directly to the regional director. I accepted within hours, not because I needed the title, but because I wanted to prove again that what I built in survival could thrive under scrutiny. And when I told Grandma, she said, "I hope they're ready. You don't come quietly anymore." 2 days before my flight, I had dinner with Natalie and asked how her policy work was going, and she said, "I submitted my proposal for mandatory transparency and education-based funding, and I'm waiting on feedback." And when I asked what made her focus on that issue, she said, "Because I remember what it looked like when nobody was watching who got what." I told her I was proud of her, and she said, "You know it's wild. They've started asking me how you're doing, like I'm your press secretary." And I said, "Just tell them I'm working," because that was always the truth. Before I left, Mom asked if we could meet briefly, and I agreed, mostly because I didn't want her turning that into another narrative about how I never gave her chances. And when we sat down, she didn't bring up the past or the future. She just said, "You turned out better than we deserved." I didn't respond right away, and when I finally did, I said, "You turned out more aware than I expected." And she smiled but didn't press. She handed me a photo from when I was 7, holding a school certificate they never displayed, and said, "I found this cleaning out the garage. I'm sorry we never gave this moment what it was worth." I took the photo, placed it in my bag, and said, "It wasn't worth anything until I made it worth something." At the airport, I sat with Grandma one last time before boarding, and she asked if I was scared to go, and I said, "No, I'm scared to stop." And she said, "Then keep moving, but never forget why you started." Natalie sent me a message the day I landed in the first country, said she was giving a speech at a local school about funding gaps and was quoting me directly, and when I asked which quote, she said, "The one about not needing permission to build." I smiled at the screen, turned my phone off, and went to the meeting that would define the next chapter of what I had already built without apology. Weeks later, after back-to-back sessions with international clients and partner firms, my regional director pulled me aside and said, "I don't know what they taught you in school, but whatever you learned in life is the real asset." I told her that's all I ever had. The truth was never about revenge. It was about control, about reclaiming the narrative they tried to write without me in it, about showing that being overlooked is not the same as being incapable. When I returned home months later, the nonprofit Natalie joined had named their new mentorship library after the scholarship I built, and when I walked in, one of the students said, "Are you the Fiona?" And I said, "No, I'm just someone who didn't quit." At the dedication event, the director asked if I wanted to speak, and I declined, choosing instead to let the students speak for themselves, because the point was never to center my voice, it was to make sure silence didn't stop theirs. My parents attended quietly, clapped at the right times, didn't ask for credit, didn't pose for pictures, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to brace for a correction. After the event, my dad said, "We've been reading everything. I just wanted to say thank you for not shutting us out completely." And I said, "I didn't keep you out, you kept yourselves out by watching instead of helping." He didn't deny it. He just nodded. At dinner later, Grandma lifted her glass again and said, "Here's to the ones who had to do it all backwards and still ended up ahead." And when everyone else raised theirs, I looked around the table and realized the people here weren't just watching. They were part of what I built. I never got the apology I imagined when I was younger. Never got the moment where they said, We were wrong and we're sorry, and we want to fix it. But I got something better, the ability to know that their approval was never required for my worth to be real. And when I walked out of that house for the last time that night, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I had taken everything that mattered with me already. What started as survival turned into something structured, something stable, something I could hand to someone else without shame or excuse. And the longer I kept building, the more I realized I didn't need closure from the people who once left me out. I just needed clarity that they no longer controlled the narrative. The girl who once begged for equal footing now sets the foundation for others. The one who was told she'd figure it out later became the reason other students didn't have to, and the voice they once ignored is now the reason other young women believe they're allowed to speak first. I never planned to forgive them for what they did in the beginning, but I also never planned to carry it with me forever, and somehow along the way I learned that letting go isn't surrender, it's just making more space for what matters now. Natalie became something more than a sibling. She became a witness who didn't flinch when the truth was finally told, someone who started asking the right questions instead of giving the comfortable answers, and that change mattered more than any apology ever could. Grandma never asked for credit, never wanted a public thank you, never kept score. She just stayed. She just showed up. She just believed loudly when others stayed silent, and everything I've done has her name written all over it, whether the plaques show it or not. Now, when students write to me, they don't ask how I handled the pain, they ask how I built around it, how I turned it into something they can hold, something they can inherit, something they don't have to be afraid to begin. I tell them all the same thing. Start even if no one claps. Keep going even if no one shows up. Finish even if the only applause comes from your own hands. You will not regret being your own witness.